Should members of the North Carolina General Assembly get a pay raise? Before you answer with a resounding no, you might want to hear what our next guest has to say. Nicholas Carnes is Assistant Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. He's studied the issue of how we pay our politicians. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Mitch.
Before we get into this question of whether our legislators need a pay raise, let's remind people this isn't a full-time job now for North Carolina lawmakers. Tell us how we go about paying them now.
Absolutely. So the way we compensate legislators in North Carolina looks a lot like what most states do. And it's a little more complicated than it seems at first glance. We pay legislators a salary, but it's only about $13,000, $14,000, a little bit more for different positions. But the average legislator doesn't take home what most people would consider a full-time paycheck. Now, there are a couple of exceptions that are important for people to understand. We also give legislators a per diem to cover lodging and food, and we reimburse them for their travel so that legislators from the western part of the state aren't paying more to send to represent their constituents in Raleigh.
Or for the ones who are in the far eastern part of the state, too. They get a lot when they come to Raleigh.
Bingo.
As well.
When people converge on Raleigh, we don't want them paying more if they're from farther away.
Right, exactly. So when we're talking about whether members of the General Assembly should get a pay raise, you have to take that existing system into account. So in looking at this issue from a scholarly perspective, how did you approach it?
Well, so I was really interested in one of the claims that proponents of pay raises for politicians make. And that is that the low pay in legislatures like North Carolina makes holding office really impossible for the average citizen of the state. And that was interesting to me because what I study primarily is the economic backgrounds or the economic diversity of our political institutions. And so this is a really exciting idea, I think. We can just bump up the pay a little bit and we'll get a more representative mix of people coming to our General Assembly.
And so you had that as a proposition to test. What'd you find as you went forward?
Well, so one of the concerns I had going in was there's not actually any research that supports this claim. So when people tell you a pay raise for politicians will get you more economic diversity, they're basing it on good hunches and on intuition, but not on real data that would compare across states or across countries or anything like that. And so what I wanted to do in my research project was actually look at the data. Do states that pay their legislatures more have a more economically diverse mix of people?
And what'd you find?
Well, the surprise was that actually they don't. When a state pays more to people who hold office in the state legislature, the economic mix of people who actually go into the state legislature is about the same, or maybe even a little more tilted towards affluent people. And the reason is that it's not really the pay that's keeping regular citizens from serving in the General Assembly or the state legislature in the first place. No matter how much you pay a politician for holding office, the thing to remember is everybody has to give up a lot of income when they run for office. There's no salary for being a candidate. And so, that seems to be the bigger barrier that keeps people from throwing their hat into the ring. The way I compare it to, it's sort of like if you told me I could get $100 if I win the Raleigh City of Oaks Marathon. I would say I can't do that. There's no way. I'm going to have to train for 100,000 hours. And then you tell me, well, what if I told you the prize was $10,000? I would say, well, that's fine, but I still can't do it. That's kind of the situation we find ourselves in when we think pay raises for politicians are going to give us a different mix of people. We have to remember that the thing that keeps most people out of office isn't the work of holding office itself, it's the work of being a candidate.
We are chatting with Nicholas Carnes. He is Assistant Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. So back to the initial question that I asked at the top of the interview, should members of the North Carolina General Assembly get a pay raise? If I'm listening to what you're saying, it sounds to me that if your goal is to improve the economic diversity, get a lot of different views, then no, raising their pay isn't going to make much difference, at least based on what you've found.
That's right. But what it's important to keep in mind is there are other sort of good reasons to think carefully about legislative compensation. And so in my research, I also looked at other studies that have analyzed the differences between states that pay more and less. And there are actually big differences, not in who runs for office, but in how much effort they devote to the task. So in a state where the legislators aren't paid as much, they tend to miss more roll call votes. They tend to be sort of less concerned about keeping up with their constituents. And what I think that reflects is just a difference in the amount of their time and energy they're devoting to the task. And so it's always sort of struck me as puzzling that supporters of pay raises point to economic diversity as the reason to do it. I think a better argument is that states that pay their lawmakers more tend to get people who are focused more on the task of governing and representing constituents. And that may be, going forward, a better way for all of us to think about the complicated and thorny issue of how much to pay our politicians.
That's certainly an interesting piece to bring up, because you're right. The argument that you often hear for higher pay is it's hard to get people to come and serve in the General Assembly. So if we paid them more, we would get a different group, a different mix of people. But what you're focusing on in this last answer is the actual effort put toward the job, which a lot of us, regardless of what we want to pay the legislators, think should be their number one task, serving us as legislators.
That's right. Our lawmakers, we have to keep in mind they're people too. And we know that everybody has lots of different jobs. You know, we all have what we do for a living, but then we have our responsibilities to our families, to our communities. And it really looks like states that pay their legislators while they're in session as though it were a full-time job get people who focus on the task of governing as if it were a full-time job. And states that don't pay as much tend to get people for whom holding office maybe takes a back seat to some of their other tasks.
I understand that as you've looked into this, you've also followed the specifics of the debate in North Carolina. What have you learned about how the approach in North Carolina has gone toward this idea of potentially raising pay?
So last February, Representative Pat Hurley from Randolph County introduced House Bill 71, a bill that wouldn't actually increase the salaries paid to the General Assembly, but would increase how much they're reimbursed for travel to and from to Raleigh, and for meals and lodging while they're visiting the Capitol. And it's been remarkable how much criticism and heat that bill has taken from people in the general public. The headlines said, politicians just want to pay themselves more. And that really elicits a powerful emotional, and I think an understandable reaction from taxpayers when they hear that kind of narrative. I think it's important for people to pay very close attention, though, to the legislation that's on the table today, because the headline, politicians are giving themselves a pay raise, really masks some of the important nuances in the bill that's on the table, or that was on the table last February, but also I think should remind all of us how hard it is for politicians who care about setting the right pay for future legislators, how much heat they're going to take in the moment for doing that.